So everybody, welcome to the chapter on advanced UV mapping. It'll be a boot camp chapter, meaning we're going to go over some very specific technical uh, topics, and you will be giving assets that you'll download, and you will be giving an assignment dealing with pre-made assets as they relate to the chapter's main focus. And the focus this time is some more advanced UV mapping and how we can get our UVs optimized for uses in game engines. The first part of this video will be UV mapping and game engine optimization. So why don't we just hop on into it? So the first topic we'll discuss, the first point of examination will be visibility of our models and how that relates to our UV maps. So as we can see that certain surfaces in games will be seen up close by the player. Whenever we have different models that'll be seen up close by the player, then we need to be able to give these models more resolution for our textures so they're more crisp. And this Dota 2 character is a very good example in two regards. One, this model right here serves two purposes. Well, three really. Um, One being it's the just a standard game model for the character. So you'll see like this kind of picture in your character select screen. Then you'll also have like an up close of his face in the character's portrait. And when you're actually playing the game, this is the kind of angle you see the character being played as. So this leads to two interesting things when we look at his UV map. So why don't we go ahead and go to Windows and bring up our UV editor. All right, so these are the UVs for our axe. We can see a few things here. One, if we select, some faces, we can see that this island right here, the shell, is his face. Look how much bigger the face island is compared to the pants or the arm or the chest area, right? The face, since it will be seen up close in the portrait view of the character, it needs to have a lot more UV space. And the bigger your UV islands, the more resolution the model will have and the crisper your textures will be. Another interesting fact about this model is since we see the character from pretty much a top-down view, we're going to see more of his upper body than his lower body. So let's look and see how the UVs relate to that concept. Right here, we have pretty much his whole lower half. I think we have like his boots right here. So these two UV islands right here, boom in the top right and boom in the bottom left. These are the two UV islands for his bottom half. If you compare these to maybe his gloves and his upper body, they're not as big. Of course, they're not quite just ultra small, but in terms of how much space they're getting, the upper body's getting a lot more love in terms of the UV layout. So when it comes to readability, you kind of want to give your islands that'll be seen by the player more often. You want to give them more space to exist on your one to one square that will be primarily UV in. All right, so that does it for visibility. Why don't we talk about readability next? And I got an example set up for us with these three cubes or rectangles or boxes. All right, so I'm going to bring up the UV editor and I want to turn on our checkerboard for each one. Now let's look at the bad example first, okay? So we'll select this guy right here. And I want to show you guys how I've UV'd it. So right now, the bottom face has its own UV island. Let me turn on this right here so we can see a colored view of the islands here. The bottom face has pretty much its own island. And then the rest of the faces all share this one island right here. And I want you guys to pay special attention to the corners here. See how there's no seams? It's kind of just like a flattened out box lid. Well, I don't know if you've ever tried to flatten out a lid before, but either you have to rip it or just crunch it down to make it flat. And we can see the effect here with the grid. Look how our UVs are getting stretched and distorted. Up here, we have nice, perfect squares, but on our sides, we're getting this weird angle distortion, weird stretching. So basically, we need to add seams to this so we can flatten this box lid out even better. So let's look at maybe a little bit, maybe a better version. And with this second cube, we can look all around it, and it looks like every single surface is pretty much squared. No distortion on this middle guy here, right? Well, let's look at his UVs. Well, that's because we have every single face cut into its own island right here, as you can see. One island, two islands, so all six faces here are pretty much their own UV island. This is not quite good either because we kind of want to minimize the amount of islands we have on models. The more UV islands we have, the higher the vertex count gets. And what's a vertex count? Well, I'll go to UI elements. Or let's go to heads up display. Let's look at our poly count. All right, so I will select the verts here. There's 8 vertices with 6 faces. Nah, it doesn't show vertex count in Maya. Well, just take my word on it. The more faces you have on a model, the more of a hit it's going to take to your game engine. So even while this looks good, it may not be the best. Also, what we have to contend with is look at all these seams we have now. There's pretty much a seam on every single edge we have here. So it's going to make texturing this guy inside of Photoshop a lot harder because we're going to have to figure out how to line up maybe a detail that curves around this edge right here. You can see from the squares they're not lining up at all. So that could, that could be an issue. Let's look and see the most effective way to UV this guy. It's kind of like the first example. We have our bottom as its own UV island right here. So there's our bottom island. And then the top is kind of like the lid example from the really bad one over here. But you'll notice while our corners are connected on the worst example, on our best example, we kind of have seams at each one of these corners right here. Right there's a corner, right there, and right there. So, we're still going to have to contend with seams and details being a little bit harder to get right across edges. But look at these edges right here. Notice how, since we still have a UV island for the top of this lid on this box, there's still one UV island. We can minimize the amount of seams here to a little bit of a degree without getting any kind of weird stretching. So notice how these squares just kind of bend over this edge. That's not too bad. That's pretty good. So readability for your meshes, it's all about balancing getting weird distortion versus having lots of seams and lots of different UV islands. And that's just a push and pull tug of war they'll be facing with pretty much each individual model that you'll be looking at. Next, why don't we discuss scene optimization or seam optimization. We're going to look at the shotgun right here, okay? In the early example, I showed that it may not be such a bad idea to have, you know, continuous UV islands going over these hard edges. But one thing you guys will start to have to contend with when you start baking more advanced maps like normal maps is when you have these hard 90-degree edges, like right here on the shotgun, for example. Well, actually, that's not one, but these edges right up here. See how they're pretty much 90-degree angles, really hard edges. And in fact, in the mesh display, we would harden those edges. So anytime there's a 90-degree angle right here, or if you've gone to mesh display and hardened those edges, there has to be a UV seam. And you can see it right here in our UV editor. Let me turn off some of these extra little features. And here we go. I'm going to zoom in to the edge here. Notice how my seam that I have selected, this hard 90-degree angle, is a seam, right? You can see it's matching um, other side here too. I have to create a separate UV island so our normal maps can be baked on without any kind of distortion or artifacting going on. And for right now, you're just going to have to take my word on it that that's the way it has to be. When you get into your normal map baking chapter in a few chapters, you'll understand a little bit more why we have to create these separate UV islands and these seams at these hard angles. It just has something to do with the way the math works when converting our high poly models into normal map details. It was a pretty tough topic for me to come to grips with. But when I learned to just accept it, my models just started looking so much better. My normal maps started coming out so much better. All right, moving right along. Why don't we start talking about UV direction layout or layout direction? And what better example to use than this hand painted weapon prop we have right here? You'll notice that whenever you hand paint something, you have to take into account things like light sources. And for this sword, I have a light source shining of it, going from the top of the blade, and it dims, it gets darker as we travel down the blade. So we can see a lot brighter colors here, going down to a more murky, darker color down here, and extending to the darkness onto the blade here, or the handle of the blade. If you look at the way I UV this guy, not only do I have things all falling in the same direction, here's the top of my blade going down to the bottom of my blade. Here's the top of my handle going down to the bottom of my handle. And even this little semicircle, little detail, this crescent circle, I have facing in the same direction in which the weapon would be held. And the thing to take away here is when you're doing, especially doing hand painted models or a lot of uh, textures you're going to be doing inside of Photoshop by hand, uh, having a UV layout that's easy to read like this will be really important. I mean, I could have done something like this, you know, to make as much space as possible, or even something crazy like that. But I chose to have a more readable UV map for this particular model here. The next topic of discussion is powers of 2 texture resolution. Even though the UVs on this sword, for instance, only covers half of the UV space, I still have a power of 2 square texture for this guy. I can bring up the textures I have for my scenes here, and why don't we take a look at them? So we have, when we get to the properties, details, dimensions, 2048 by 2048 for the sword, properties, details, 2048 by 2048 for the granite, properties for the shotgun, 2048 by 2048. And this Dota texture is a little bit different. We have 2048 by 1024 for our Dota character. Um, Even still, it's powers of 2. So let's go through them. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, and that's about as high as we go up to in terms of textures. So every texture you make will be some combination of those powers of 2. Game engines just need them to be powers of 2, so uh, it's actually more optimized, and the game runs better, and your models look better in the end. I won't get into behind. I won't get into the technical nature behind why that is. Partly because it's a little above my head with the software engineering, and second, it would probably take it'd be a mouthful to explain in this lecture. All you have to know is always rules of 2. There's no exception to that rule ever. Powers of 2. Why don't we talk about UV island border padding? Um, so you can look at my sword here, and this is kind of a conservative example. But if I zoom in, you can see that around the borders, I'll turn border draw on, so my borders are thickened, so you can get a better sense of my borders. If I zoom in, you can see I've kind of overpainted beyond the borders of my UV islands here. Um, just to make a quick, long story short, Whenever these textures and models get into a game engine and they're seen from far away, then the UV maps here get kind of squished and crunched up. They kind of get distorted inside the game engine. So when that happens, they start these bounds started kind of like creeping up like here. So while it was once like this, whenever the models get farther away, the UVs get blurry, and we start coming into this territory. So if you don't have anything there and it kind of goes into this gray area, guess what you're going to get on your models? You're going to get these weird gray seams when up close they look just fine, but far away they start looking like poop. So we have to overdraw our overpaint on our UV borders. And the rule of thumb is leave 8 pixels or so for each border. So you should have about 16 to 20 pixels between each island that you lay out. Let's look at another example. Here's my granite character. You can see how I've overdrawn on my UVs right here. And notice how I've given plenty of space for each UV island to have an overdrawn color on them. It's just what we do when we start making our textures. You know, even the Blizzard or Valve made Dota 2 character has overdrawn textures. So if you don't believe me, maybe you can believe Dota 2. And we can look at my gun. Boom, over painted borders. So this is the padding that I'm talking about. It ensures that we just don't get weird seams in our models from a distance in our game engines. So our next topic of discussion are mirroring UVs. And I'm going to bring up my granite character right here. Um, in order to conserve, or in order to get as much resolution as possible on my character, it's possible to have UVs that overlap one another. So I'll select these guys right here. So I have all these shells selected, and I'll get into why they're over here in a second. And I'll just plop them over here. So right now, as you can see, when I moved them over one unit, we have mirrored duplicated UVs sitting right on top of one another, right? That allows me to only have to paint one half of my character's face, so I can make his UV island even bigger. But I chose for something like the chest, instead of duplicating it and mirroring it, I gave it its own UV island for the left and right side of the character, so I could get this asymmetrical detail, this bandolier drawn in on him. Otherwise, it would be mirrored from side to side, and I wouldn't be able to get this interesting asymmetrical design up. Same thing for his back. But say for something like his arms here, there's his left arm, and I'll do an inverse selection. Now I have his right arm selected. So his arms are actually mirrors of one another, but his chest remains the same. His face right there, and his face right there. Boom. Same UV island. So let me go back, and there's one extra little thing we usually have to do for mirrored UVs. After you duplicate your mesh, and I'll show you an example of that later on in the video of how we can make sure our UVs are directly mirrored on top of one another. You can't really eye it too well. I mean, you could try to come in here and zoom in a lot. We can dim that and just try to like put him right on top there. But at the end of the day, if I zoom in by a line, we have that much difference between the two UV island borders. So I'll maximize thinking the border, and you can see how they're just not sitting on top of one another. So to get around that, what you'll usually do is you'll cut your characters or your models in half, like so, and you'll only UV like the right half, and then you'll mirror flip over, create this side, and guess what? Your UVs get mirrored as well, and they're sitting right on top of one another. And then what you do is you select, before you combine your mesh, you select all the pieces that have been mirrored, and normally they're sitting right on top of your model. We have this nice little tool here. We'll set it at 1 unit, and then we can move it up, down, Well, I just selected something I shouldn't have. There we go. What we're going to do is we're going to, every UV that's laying on top of one another, we're going to put it in its own UV space. And since this one-to-one square repeats indefinitely, then if we just move it to the left, the same texture is going to repeat over here. So now we don't have any overlapping UVs, and any UVs that we've mirrored from doing some modeling can exist in this second quadrant, and our original UVs will exist in this first one. It's a little bit tough to understand at first, I guess, but maybe with a practical example, you guys can see what's going on there. The next concept to talk about is called what we call UV atlasing. And a good example for that is to view our spaceship right here. And now let's take a look at this spaceship texture. When I started this project, I wanted to have a spaceship or spaceship parts that you could just insert to one another and create your own kind of spaceship layout. All right. So my main goal was to have a bunch of different parts that all share the same texture. So what I did was I went in and I just drew out some generic spaceship type hull textures that you've maybe, everybody can recognize, that being like rivets and just some sci-fi design, and then really weird armor plating, and then this weird like little hexagon design, totally science fiction. And of course this weird little, I don't know, alien little ruins thing design, plus a lot of little details like console panels. I went ahead and textured all this before I even started modeling my spaceships. And then what I did was I would go in and UV each one of these pieces separately. And if I go to mesh, separate, you can see that my wing right here has its own thing going on, its own UVs, but they share the same UV texture. They share the same texture sheet. So this is what we call atlasing, when we put multiple separate meshes on the same model here. Okay, a very important concept, because the fewer materials, fewer textures we have in a game, the faster the game runs. So if we can cram a bunch of props or a bunch of different parts of maybe something that's modular, like the spaceship setup I have, if we can cram all those models onto the same texture, our games are going to be even more optimized and run even better. And finally, the last step of the process is what we call puzzling out our UVs together. And I want to bring up my Granok character one more time. Basically, puzzling is it's actually kind of like building out a jigsaw puzzle almost. You're trying to take all your islands and then fit them in this one-to-one square without wasting as much space as possible. So all this gray that you see here is just wasted pixels that are going to waste. I can't take advantage of them. But you also have to make sure that every single one of your details has the border edge padding, is laid out kind of in the right direction, um, is mirrored correctly. So you have to take into account all the previous concepts and rules of thumb to create the most effective and efficient UV layout for your models, like so. So I think this is a pretty good puzzled out UV layout. So it's just a matter of trial and error most of the time. Sometimes it takes me 3 or 4 attempts to get the best layout for my models. And there are a few tools out there that can maybe get us started on the right foot, some automated layout tools that we can mess around with, but we shouldn't rely on. For the most part, you will be puzzling out this stuff by hand, um, you know, 8 times out of 10. So getting used to figuring out what shapes can fit where, what parts of the model need to be a lot larger than the other parts due to readability of the model, things of that nature. Okay, those are pretty much the most important rules of thumb to go over with the scope of game engine UV layouts. Why don't we go ahead and start talking about some specific tools in Maya that can help us achieve the best possible UV layouts? The very first thing you'll need to learn how to use is the UV editor, and that can be found in Windows UV editor. This is your workspace for all things UV. Much like your scene view here is where you model out your polygons, your UV editors where you puzzle out and lay out and unfold and relax and align and flip all the things we'll be doing to our UVs to get them to lay out on a flat um, surface. So we can take these UV outlines into Photoshop and begin to texture these little models here. So the first tool we're going to look at, and I'm going to go ahead and collapse some of the tools up here that we're really not going to use. I'll go ahead and maximize here. Let me see. Let me get set up. Be right back. Okay, I'm back. Set up just the way I want it. And I'm going to demo a lot of these things with the sword model that you guys will be UVing. So you can kind of see a sneak peek of how I UV'd the sword myself. So why don't we talk about these, what we call the UV tools right here. If you hover your mouse over each tool, you'll get what it's called or what it does. So you can see show or hide the UV tool. So if you don't see some of the things I'm seeing, or I have some things hidden, like these guys right here, I don't really use those, so I'm hiding them. Then you can just click or hover over these things and get some context clues. So these guys right here, these four little boys right here, I'll zoom in on them. Why don't we talk about these first? Let me move this magnifier box. These four tools right here allow us to kind of tweak the actual position of our islands and our UVs. So why don't we quickly go over and see how they function? I'll just zoom out. So why don't we start with the UV lattice tool? So if I select a few UVs here, I'll hold right shift or right click and select UV. If I select these UVs right here, we get a lattice box similar to the lattice that we were using in a few chapters. And instead of moving the actual UVs, I move this box around, and it's allowing me to kind of place my UVs more organically. So that's what that tool does. The next tool is the Move UV Shell. So we select one UV, and with our UV shell highlighted right here, if I select one UV, every single UV gets selected, and I can move the whole island, the whole shell. Same thing here. It just allows me to select the whole shell. So I'll unclick it. I'll unclick it by pressing Q on the keyboard just to go into selection mode. Or I could press W, and that undoes it. So we have Q to select, W to move, E to rotate, R to scale, like always. Consider these four guys up here just different kinds of like move tools like that, but I don't know exactly what the keyboard shortcuts for them would be. But if you want to get out of this mode right here, you can just press Q or W on the keyboard, and it'll go back to something you're probably more akin to. Select shortest edge path right here is an interesting tool. So if I select it and it's lit up, I can select one vertice, or UV rather, one UV point. And then on the same UV island, I can select another one. And what it does is it selects the edges that get you there the quickest between the two, the shortest path of edges between 2 points. So I can select that one, and go all the way down here. Let me make sure I'm in the right tool. I'll select that, and it finds the path of least resistance. We can even do something extreme. So you can see, if I want to just select maybe this little curvy path here, I can select the end of this cool curved edge right here, and I can select the start and end, and it'll just select that edge for me. Now I can do whatever I want to that edge, like maybe sew it or cut it or whatever you have. So it's a pretty little useful tool. allows you to select multiple edges. Otherwise, you'd be doing something like this. Click, let me go into edge mode, press Q on the keyboard to get out of selecting that. Click, 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 click. Okay, that's driving me nuts. When I could just select the beginning UV on that edge and the ending UV on those edges. Boom. Now I have the edge selected that I want. The last tool in this section of guys right here is the Tweak UV tool. And basically it just allows you to select a UV and instantly start moving it. Let me get out of edge mode here. I'll select the Tweak UV tool. I can just click once and drag. It's no big deal. You'll notice that it'll also select an edge with it that you're moving. So it's just a quick way to kind of do something like, I don't know, instead of going to UV, selecting UV, then pressing W to do that. It's just another way to do that, but few fewer steps. The next set of brushes or tools that I'll be talking about are our brushes right here. They're a bit temperamental. I don't use them too much. They're mainly used for more organic shapes where you want more of a hand touch on something. So why don't we look and see a few examples so you can get an idea of why I feel like there's just a bit too unwieldy for our skill level right now. Um, the grab UV tool, for instance. Notice how I get this circle. It's basically like a brush. It allows me to grab any UV within my circle here and just start nudging it around. I can change the diameter of this brush here, holding down B for brush and left clicking and dragging. So you can see I can change with B and left click the diameter of my brush. So, you know, a little bit useful if you want a more organic artist touch on things. And I'll let you guys experiment with each one. Remember, you can hover your mouse over. Um, there's a few cool ones here. What is this? Optimize. There's one where you can just cut around. So we can cut UVs just by painting. So here we have two new islands because I kind of just painted. And it's like almost using scissors in a way. So it could be useful, right? I'll let you guys experiment with that and see if you can find any clever uses. But I rarely use these. I like selecting things um, with purpose. The flip and rotate tools are pretty useful, especially when dealing with mirrored UVs, maybe. So I'm going to hold down right click and go into shell so I can select whole UV shells, and I'll bring this mirrored sword edge over here. And why don't we look and see what flip in the U direction does? Oh, it like mirrors it, right? If I flip it in the V direction, now it goes upside down. Pretty useful if you just want to mirror or flip something. On that same token, we can use the rotate buttons right below and rotate like so. You'll notice that it rotates in, a very exact angle. If you want to adjust that angle, we can go to polygons, rotate, and we can change this value to maybe to like something like 45. We can hit apply, and there we go. Or we can go to rotate and do 90 and hit apply, and now we got a full 90-degree rotation. But by default, the flip buttons or the rotate buttons in your toolbar up here will go by 45 degrees. But if you want something a little bit more exact, you can always go to polygons, rotate, and then extra options right here, this little square. And if I want to rotate it by negative 15 degrees, I can. Or I can rotate it by positive 15 degrees, and it'll go the other direction. So negative and positive will dictate which direction you actually can rotate it. Useful if you need a really exact rotation. why don't we start talking about moving and sewing some UVs? I'm going to select this little box here to demonstrate sewing UVs or separating along a selected edge. Uh, as you can see in this example, this is the one with the box lid where there were no seams on the corners, so we got a lot of distortion, as opposed to this setup where we had seams at the corners with no distortion. So if we wanted to replicate that outcome, what we would do is we would go to the corners here, we would select them, hold down right click, go into edge mode, we would select these edges, and then we would go to separate UVs along selected edge. And it doesn't look like it's done anything, but if I go to UV and just single click to select one UV, look how they are split now. Before, let me undo that. Before, if I would have single clicked and grabbed a UV, they're going to be connected. But by selecting these edges and pressing the cut separate UVs along selected edges, they're now their own little, they're their pretty much, they're on their own little seam right now. And now we're getting something closer to the good example you can see right here. We can go a little bit more extreme with the separation. Instead of separating edges that we selected, we can actually select a UV point and use the separate selected UV into one of each. Okay, basically what it does is you select the UV, any edge that's attached to it now becomes separated. See how it just broke all three of those little edges apart? Now we have three different corners. I can do this. I'll do it one more time. I'll select this simple UV right there. I'll do our separate the selected UV into one for each connect. That's a weird tool, but basically after I click it, every single edge has been separated from one another. Now we have three separate corners. Or one UV has become three UVs now. Okay, let me undo that because that can be a destructive workflow right there. Or you know what? Well, I guess I could just sew them back together. Which brings us to sew. I can try to eyeball maybe these edges again and put them back together. All right. And if I select the edges here that I want to sew together again and click on sew the selected edges together, boom. You can see they've kind of jittered. And now I have one single UV and that edge is resewn. If I select this edge, these edges right here, and do the same thing, boom, they get sewn together. You'll notice how the UVs kind of snap or merge together as closely, kind of a merge to center thing going on, right, with our verts. Instead, when we sew, our UVs get merged in the crossfire. So now we've kind of fixed those little weird edges that I just made, like so. Move and sew takes sewing to a whole new level. So if I select these edges right here, notice how if we just did that, it wouldn't be very good. Look, we got a lot of weird overlapping, a lot of distortion. If I select move and sew, then it picks one of the islands and literally just plops it up on here. Now I have no more distortion. So you can literally just click any edge and move and sew them together. Move and sew. Um, Move and sew. Oh, now we got that distortion again. Let's not do that. Move and sew. Pretty nice little tool there. Let's take a look at the layout and grid and relax tools right here. So let me go and what I'm going to do is select this box right here, bring back my UVs, and I'm just going to kind of place these shells in random areas, these islands in random areas. All right, so my UVs are kind of just all over the place, right? I'll even rotate them in weird ways. Well, we have an automated tool that allows us to uh, quickly puzzle our UVs, which means lay them out for us. And if I just click pack, it won't do anything, but let me select the shells, and then I'll select faces to be moved in the UV space, and boom. It just puts them in there fast as possible. Doesn't really change the rotation, doesn't really change the scale of them. If we wanted something with a little bit more oomph to it, we can go to polygons, and we can go to layout, and go to the extra options. And there's all kind of options in here we can pick from. So we can rotate free. We can even dictate our padding with percentage space. So if we do a low percentage space and pack them, see how they get rotated nice for us, but there's not much edge padding between our border edges there. So let me undo that. I want to go back to layout again, make that percentage a little bit bigger and apply. Now we have some nice edge padding here. You'll notice, I think I could probably go in and, do a better job. Look, I could have done this. In fact, I could have done that and then maybe made those bigger because maybe they're more visible. Readability, remember? I could have just scaled those up like so. It's all about getting as much resolution as you can out of your UVs. And that's why, and I'll grab those and I'll rotate them. And then we can place them right there. And look how much more space we've saved. Less empty space. Let me go back to how I originally did it. Look how much empty space was there from the automated. So the automated layout can save you some time, get you started, but you see that when I put just a few seconds of my own puzzling into it, I was able to get maximize the UV space as much as possible. Here's another little tool called the grid that is somewhat helpful. Let's say you have, I don't know, kind of like a hard surface, a shape that should be kind of, almost straight up and down, kind of like these are straight up and down, but it's just a little bit off. Well, if we select those UVs and go to grid, it's not doing it the way I want it. I want it to kind of go straight up and down. So I'm going to go to polygons, and then I can go to grid extra options, and I can make my grid UV a little bit smaller. Now when I press grid, oh, well, maybe that's too small. Let me go and change that value. 512. Well, anyway, let's just do it by hand. This will be the better example. So I'm trying to get them straightened up as much as possible, but it's just not working out too well. Well, I'll tweak them by hand, and then this tool is not working like it should. Okay, there we go. I have to do it from this menu here. So I can go down to 512 grid and hit apply. You see how they're kind of snapping too? Boom. So you can either be, distorted, but the grid's kind of lining them up for us just a little bit more. And the align tools will be learning in a second can help us do that too. So it's just grid's going to be something you'll just play around with, like I just did, to get it to work for us. So why don't we look at a quick example of unfolding, okay? And I think the best way to do that would be to go back to our bad example of the box. And why don't we go ahead and sew these edges back together like so. So we can start fresh. So what we want to do is we want to take this connected flat box that give us these really distorted UVs like so. We want them to look really nice like this. But we have to put those seams in there, and then we have to make sure that every single surface is getting enough UV space. So why don't we select the bad box, and we'll go through that process, and I can show you how Unfold can help us achieve this look. So I'm going to select every edge where I want to put a seam. I'll use my cut around selected edges. And now, just to prove to you I've cut it, now it's separated. But how do I get it flattened out so it looks, you know, so it looks like this, nice and, you know, geometric, right? Instead of all weird and crooked. Well, I'm going to select all of my UVs, and I'm going to press Unfold Selected UVs. And there we go. But you'll notice it kind of shifted the direction, the layout of everything. So we kind of have to be careful of what we're doing. So why don't we go to Polygons, and we can go to Unfold here, and then the extra options right there. All right. First of all, let's turn pack off so it doesn't pack anything up. And let's try that now. Boom. All right, so now you'll see that we're good to go, but it's kind of at an angle. So why don't we see if we can use tools to fix that. I'll kind of just rotate it up as much as I can, but it's still going to be a little crooked. Maybe I can use grid. There we go. See how grid snap things so it's straight up and down? Kind of made it more rigid, more geometric. That's what grid's good for. And now I've taken the bad box lid example and made it into the best example box lid. So good UV practices. So let's talk about the align tools real quick. And I use these tools a lot. Let's say that, when we unfolded that box lid from earlier, we were kind of get left with like these kind of off kilter edges. See how they're at angles and not that attractive, right? Just not the best. Pretty much the whole UV. I've had UVs come out like this before. I've had to kind of go in and fix them. Well, our line tools are perfect. So I'll show you what each four of these do. All right, so I'm going to select these top two UVs. I'll hold right click and make sure I'm in UV. And then depending on if I press up or down, if I press up, then all the UVs selected will snap up to the very tallest, the very highest one selected. So you see how that bottom one aligned to that top one over there? Vice versa, if I press down, this boy comes down over and lines with that one. And that's useful with multiple ones even. I can press up. And now I got a straight even line there. And I can even come down here and go downwards. Now they're aligned. I can even hit the G key and repeat that same downward alignment. And it even works left to right. So I'll align to the left. I'll align to the right. I'll select all of these down here and align to the left, and select all those and align those to the right. And now I've fixed that janked up crookedness of my UV, and it looks nice and neat. The display menu right here is another pretty important one. Let's see. Let me change to another model. So I'll select my granite character right here. And with these display tools, I can show the UV texture that's attached to it or hide it. Or I can go right below it and dim it. So that can be useful sometimes. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to see your UV edges and whatnot if it's too bright. So you can either get them out of the way or you can dim them. The next few tools will be really quick. So let's just roll through them real quickly. The checkerboard, we can turn off the grid on and off. So we can get a clearer view of our UVs without the checkerboard grid being in the way. Or rather the grid. The checkerboard right here. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We can click the thicken UV border. So every border edge on our UVs now will become thick. We can see exactly where our seams are in our UV layout. So all these guys are really thick, like so. I can even turn on the checkerboard right here to see how um, my UVs are laying out on my model here. And you can see that organic models are just going to have a little bit of distortion here and there. It's kind of just how organic models roll. Um, you're never going to be able to get an organic model to lay flat like something, say, like a box. So you'll see a little bit of stretching on organic models like this. So that's not terrible. Why don't we continue? I'll turn off the checkerboard. Um, this is a good one. We can actually give color. Yeah, I was just on the wrong model for a second. I can dim it and then give color to my UV islands. So you can see some of my UV islands just get different colors so we can differentiate them a little bit easier. And this one's pretty nice. This allows you to see, kind of some of the distortion. So if you're getting some UV islands with, I don't know if I can find any on this, but see how we have different shades of red? That's kind of like a hot and cold temperature gauge to show us, exactly how distorted we're getting here. So the whiter it is, the less distorted it is, but the darker the color, whether it be red or blue, that's where more stretching and distortion will come from. And again, organic models, you just can't get around it. We just work with it. So I don't think that, that's technically, don't think that's wrong. It's just the way it is. A lot of what I say is truth kind of stuff going on right now, right, guys? That's just kind of, that's just, unless you want me to get into some like weird algorithms about how all this math works, you are just going to have to take my word for it. And the last little tool in our UV editor is the nudge. I kind of displayed that earlier. Remember, this Granock has overlapping mirrored UVs. So when we duplicate our mesh, the parts that we want to have, overlapping UVs, so we can have mirrored textures and basically just have more resolution for each. Say this is our arm. What I'm looking at right here is our, I think it's either our arm or glove. Instead of having this half the size and having to fit two separate arms on here, I just duplicated the mesh after UVing the right side of it. And then we get overlapping UVs. And then a good standards in practice, especially for when you're baking normal maps, is to take all of your overlapping UVs from the mesh you just duplicated and using our nudge tool to type in 1 unit to the left. And since our texture repeats to infinity, this 1-to-1 space repeats on all these squares into infinity, moving over our duplicated UVs will still be, it will be perfect because this is it's exactly in the same space right down to the nanometer. I'm making that up, but you get what I mean. And since this texture duplicates, these the left side of this model is going to get the exact same texture information. We just don't have textures sitting on top, directly on top of one another anymore. So that's what the nudge UV tool is good for. So I can just move it all around here. And since I'm moving in 1 unit at a time, it doesn't matter where I put them. They're always going to get that same texture information. So why don't I show us a few practical examples of some of these techniques. Yeah, that's he's become bubblegum boy. I'll turn off this distortion field right there. There we go. Maybe turn off the thickness of the UV borders. All right, he's back to normal. Why don't I show us an example of atlasing our ship? So for right now, I'm going to hide all these guys right here. I should have made separate layers for them. I'll just hide them like that. Okay. So when I first had this ship, they were all combined like so. So I'll just go through and pretend they were already combined. And we'll just get started like we have to UV this ship. You can already see I have some textures on there laid out um, from my previous atlasing. But why don't we go into 5 mode and pretend like those don't exist. And another little word to the wise, and the certain project that I ripped this from, I had a lot of transparencies going on. So a lot of these little random squares you see are actually separate faces. So if I go to mesh and separate, you can see that these are actually their own meshes. And I was doing a technique called decaling, which I was using transparent features to spice up, you know, the textures here. Because since these textures pretty much use the same pattern right here, it would be pretty boring just to see that same pattern around. So I used some decals, like these guys right here had transparency all around them. So I was just sticking these decals on top of this saucer to break up the monotony of that repeated texture. But what I'm going to do, and you guys can go ahead and delete those decals. We don't need them. So I'm going to select, after I've separated this, I'm going to select the major pieces of the ship and then hold down shift and do an inverse selection. You can see I have all the decals selected now. I'm just going to delete them. We'll just get rid of them. And what we got to do is we got to figure out a way to atlas all these UVs together on the same texture map right here. In fact, I'm going to just pretend like these UVs don't exist, or this texture doesn't exist anymore. I'm just going to UV from scratch. All right, so we'll get these out of here. I just like, when I start UVing, I just like shoving the existing UVs not far away, but out of my positive 1 to 1 space right here. And then what I'm going to do is, I see that I got some mirrored details right here. I'm going to delete all the details on the left side of my ship, because when I UV this, whenever I duplicate this wing, I already want it UV'd, so I don't have to UV 2 wings. And why don't I go ahead and do a modify freeze transformation, like so. Well, that's weird. Freeze, reset. Objects. My handles are really weird right now. That's weird. Okay. I'm not worried about that. I'm not going to be worried and working in the scenes. So why don't we go ahead and let's do something we call exploding the model. So I'm going to select every single piece of my ship that I put together, right? And I don't know if you've taken animation, but here's our animation timeline at the bottom with every single piece, every single mesh selected. And in my timeline set at like the first frame, I'm going to press S for Scorpion on my keyboard. And then I'm going to drag over to, I don't know, 50 seconds. And then while I'm at 50 seconds, I'm going to take each individual model here. I don't know why my handle's like that. And I'm going to separate it. Now I'm going to select them again, and I'm going to press S right here. And then you can see on my timeline, I can scrub between 1 and 50. 50, everything's separated, and I have my own space to look at them. And at 1, they're all connected like they were to begin with. That's a nice little technique called exploding your model. Really handy for floating geometry type things. So I'm going to go ahead and explode them so I can look at this saucer without anything getting in my way here. And what I'm going to do with this saucer is I'm going to go into face mode, and I'm going to cut it in half. I'm only going to texture the top half of this boy. And then what I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to go ahead and plop down some UVs. I'm just going to go ahead and select the faces on the top of this saucer right here. So just the top faces, and I'm going to give it a sloppy UV camera-based projection. That's a technique you learned from your basic UV introduction, so I didn't feel like going over them again. And this is somewhat okay, but I feel like we could unfold them a little bit easier. So I'm going to select these UVs and go to unfold and click it a few times, and it looks like it's spaced out properly. Now I'm not going to place my UVs my newly made UV directly on the one-to-one. I'm going to kind of place the UVs I've made correctly for this piece right up here to the top left. Now I'm going to go back to my saucer and finish UV in this guy. Okay. All I have left to do now is UV down here. Okay. If you're ever sure what you haven't UV'd left, with that single mesh selected, like so, you can see these faces right here are just kind of in la la land. You can see what faces they relate to. If I go into wireframe mode by pressing 4, I can see those faces haven't not been textured. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just go ahead and select them all. I'm going to do a UV. I'm going to do another camera-based projection, and let's see what that looks like. And that looks like crap. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick some edges right here and right here, and I'm going to pick the polar opposite on the other side, those edges right there. Now I'm going to go into my UV editor, and I'm going to cut them, separate UVs along the selected edges. So that did something, I swear. See, two separate meshes now. Now I'm going to unfold that one. Whoa, it just got huge. Let me undo that. So what we have is kind of like a roundish little guy right there. I think we'll have the same thing for him too. Let's see. Let me redo it. I want to unfold them at the same time. Okay. They're just not going to be the same height. You know what? I think I can optimize this even more. If I go in and cut down the center, just delete this down, right down the center, guess what? I only have to UV this bottom part, hold down Shift and the greater than sign to select up and get this little ridge right here that we didn't have UV'd yet. And you know what? I'm just only going to UV this one little bit right here. Camera based. And then I'm going to unfold. Okay. And I'm going to swing it around, and my job right now is to, even though it is circular, I got to ask myself, is that going to be hard to texture? Should I try to line them all up straight, make them straight, kind of adjust it like this, spend the time to do it straight, something like that, and then do some alignment? Or should I leave it curved? Well, why don't we open up our distortion, and let's see what happens when we start rotating it and moving it. See how we start getting discolorations? So if we made it straight, that's when we would start getting some distortion. So I'm going to leave it cupped like that. And I'm going to go into shell, and I'm going to kind of shrink it down and just rotate it a little bit. I'll worry about all that stuff later. I'm going to try to get it around the same height as the rest of that saucer. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is, let me hold down D and X and V, put my pivot point right in the center. I'm going to Control D and do a -1 on the X scale. And I'm going to, yeah, that's because I have that distortion on. Let me turn that off. Now I got these two guys. Okay, yeah, there we go. And I'll mesh, combine them. And I'll even merge the verts. And as you can see here, overlapping UVs. And that's fine. They can overlap without them being centered yet. And then I'll do the same thing. Do a -1. Select them, mesh, combine. and merge. So now what I have is just the quarter of the saucer UV'd, and that quarter, this top half corner right here, is going to be duplicated there, duplicated on this bottom half, and duplicated on this bottom half. But I'm not going to puzzle them yet. I'm going to leave them kind of just floating like that. Why don't I look at this cockpit next? So this cockpit's interesting. It's got some weird geometry on it. What's the best way to do this? I think I'm just going to select each one of these little cockpit faces in this bottom part. And I'm just going to do an automatic map on these. Like so. I'm just going to use automatic map for this for the most part. And then these guys right here. I got to figure out where I want to make some seams. So I can just select this top part. That's what I'll do. And I'll look at it from the top. Generate UVs. Camera based. And then I get this. And then let's unfold them. There we go. So that's unfolded. Whoa, what did I do? So that part's unfolded. We still have that to worry about down there. Okay. And then I have the front part here. Well, looks like those faces have already been UV'd, so I'll forget those. I'll just do this little bottom U part right here. That's already been UV'd. Grab those, lay out like so, and just kind of scale them so they're kind of the same size. See what faces we have left. All right, the back part, so I'll undo those at the bottom. So, you know, I'm switching between my scene view and my UV view quite a lot, so you can do both. All right, so I got the back of the cockpit braces selected, UV camera based. I'll go into UV, select just the UVs of the newly made thing. And now you see why I like to kind of shove away these UV islands, because whenever you do a projection, it gets put right in the center, and I don't have to worry about, you know, it getting put right on top of these, for instance. It goes right to the center, I don't have to worry about it. And then flatten those out, or unfold those. I flatten them out. And I can do that. And then I'll have left are the faces down here. And I can do a UV camera based, grab those UVs, and do an unfold on those. I'm going to go and move UV shell, so I just select one of these guys. I'll select them all. And then get them horizontal. We can separate them like this. And there we go. So that's my cockpit UV'd. And for brevity of the video, I'm not going to go and UV that last little wing right there. I will show us how we can start puzzling out our models here. So I selected both of the things I've just UV'd. Then I'm just going to right click and go into shell and just grab these guys. Okay, so my saucer is pretty huge. It's probably the biggest part of my model here. So if I go back and unexplode it, you can see that the surface of this saucer, looking for readability, right? It's probably going to be the majority of the UV map. So I'm going to even maybe let it take up half of it. But this guy right here, he's not too, I mean, kind of in the front, so yeah, it might be a little important too. So you know what, I'll just scale it down like so. fit him on this 1-to-1. And then I'll just bring that out a little bit. There we go. So now I got this cockpit to think about. Look how big these UVs are compared to my saucer. And look how big my mesh cockpit is compared to the mesh saucer. So these are going to have to be a lot smaller in relation. And you know, the braces here probably won't have that much detail. So I'm going to kind of group them up together. I'll put that one right there. And I'll inset that brace inside of this guy. So there's my braces. And I'll make these even smaller. I'll just shove them up in a corner right there. And these windows probably will have a little bit more space. So there we go. I'm wasting. So I think I can rotate them up like that. There we go. And it's just about fitting these things in as easy as possible. And if you really want to do readability for UV maps, since these are the horizontal ones, you can kind of get them facing the right direction. You know, something like that. And then that's like the top or bottom. And there we go. And that leaves enough room to atlas this wing in there. And you can just fit that wing on the bottom right hand right there. So not too bad. Why don't we look at an example of some hard edge UVing? I'm not going to do it for you, but I'll kind of walk you through the UVs of the shotgun right here. So why don't we just, I'll just delete that for right now. I'm done with it. I won't save. Where's Beatrice? Display, show, all. It's not what I wanted. There we go. That's what I wanted actually. I'll put that on its own layer. And I'm just doing some quick dirty stuff for the purposes of the video. So here's our shotgun. And why don't we look, I've kind of already shown you some of the hard edge stuff. In fact, I really won't talk about it too much more, but let's look at some more hard edges where I had to separate and make seams. So I'll select these hard edges right here, right? And in fact, maybe a little bit easier way to see where my seams are. I think we go to display, polygons, and go to border edges or texture border edges. If I select that, every single seam in my model here becomes thicker, like so. So that's nice. Well, wait a minute. Polygons, texture, turn that off. Maybe I should just go border edges. There we go. Well, no, it's not really showing the texture border edges. I was right the first time. Texture border edges like so. And then we can see like all these little hard edges right here are thicker because I had to create these cuts here because of the severe angles. So I'll select these edges again, and then we can look and see where those exist on my UV map. And right here, you can see how they have the edge right there separated, and then the joining pieces. So it's a pretty complicated model. I even go so far as like, look at how I had to separate this little face right here. Let's see why I had to separate that face into its own island. Look at this little detail right here. If it wouldn't stop jittering around, geez. I'll select a vertex. See how this little edge comes out right here? Severe angle, severe angle, severe angles. So really, if I wanted the normal map to bake correctly around here, I pretty much had to make this little guy his own island. Right, like so right there. But it's fine, it turned out for the best. I got a pretty good texture out of it. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind to consider. All right, let's switch gears and look at some organic UV mapping. All right, let's bring back our scary looking guy. I had a friend, my best friend growing up. He saw what I was doing with this stuff, and I showed him this model many years ago, and he said he would have reoccurring nightmares about this guy showing up in his in his dream. I mean, that is kind of creepy, I guess. Anyway, why don't we see how we can UV this face? So the first thing we're going to do is why don't we cut this guy right down the center? We have to be really careful to get just the thing UVs the faces right now. Look how good I am. First try. Oh, got thwarted. Missed some down there. All right, great. So now we only have to worry. It looks like I missed a few more right there. I guess I'm not as good as I thought I was. Right down the center of the grid. And in fact, I don't have this guy perfectly aligned on the grid, so let me fix that. All right. So I need to, there we go. I need to do something here. Snap this there, and then my handles are all messed up for some reason right now. Let's see, reset tool. There we go. I just went to reset tool and had the axis orientation set up right. So now I know the center pivot line is right down the center of the grid. I was having trouble with that a second ago. All right. So when we're UVing this face, we have to take into account a few considerations. First, we have to find where his neckline is. So why don't we select something like, you know what? Forget that. Why don't we just go ahead and start isolating his ears and such? So I'm going to grab this texture or this edge loop around his ear. What's the best way to do this? No, I was right the first time. Why don't we go ahead and select the whole head and then select kind of like this a neck hole of a shirt. You know, maybe we'll go down even that far or something. No, I think that's too far. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and just poop out a camera-based projection of this guy's face. It won't be very good, but I need to get started by laying out something here. And I'm just going to bring that over here. Why don't I go ahead and get rid of all the rest of these guys in the center? I don't like, see how they kind of overlapped? I'm just going to get them out of the way. So we have this right here, but we can't lay this out because we got some complex shapes getting in our way, like this ear right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this edge loop around the ear. And since I modeled it so well, it's just a continuous edge loop. And I'm going to go into my texture editor here. Now I'm going to click cut those edges. And now the ear is its own separate guy. And why don't we see if we can just unfold this ear? See what happens when we unfold the ear. Boom. We get a somewhat decent ear unfold. Not the best, but I think it'll work. Okay. In fact, I can go into checkerboard mode and see the distortion. And you know what? It's pretty much square for the most part. Again, remember I said that organic shapes, you're not going to get perfect squares on them. So that's one less complex shape to worry about. And I am just flying all over the place here. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is probably go in and isolate out this mouth box. This is a pretty common technique to have an inside little mouth box for your character. So I'm going to select the inside of his lip edge loop here. And since it's a continuous edge, I just have to select the edges right there. And that should be a continuous seam that I can do. So again, I'm going to hit cut UVs along the selected line, and I should be able to isolate the mouth box. Select the UVs, unfold it, and there's my mouth box unfolded. I'm just sliding these guys out of the way here. Okay. A few more considerations. We have this nose hole right here. So I want to go in here and double click, or I guess I'm going to have to click by hand, the edge ring around this nose. Sorry for my camera being so crazy. It's just the reality I'm facing right now. See how I'm isolating a seam around this nostril hole? I can then cut and then to shell. Well, let me select the UV here. And then I can use my Move UV Shell tool. It'll bring out the whole little nostril for me. Go to UV, go to lay it out. And it's just flopping it down like a little pancake. Okay. I might be able to get away. This eyelid looks a little complex, but why don't we go ahead and just unfold the face now? So that's a little technique I like doing. Sometimes I'll just select a few UVs, I'll hold down the control key and the right click and go to shell. That'll select all the UVs on the whole island or the whole shell. I'm just going to flatten this guy out like so. Oh, that's scary looking, isn't it? That's disturbing me. Okay. So now we have one half of his face pretty much like folded out. What if you wanted to have it where you wanted to have a scar on one eye, but not a texture scar on the other? Well, why don't we look at another way we can unfold this face real quickly? What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate one half, do a -1x scale. So now we got the right side of his face. All right. So here are the UVs. Shell there. So if I select both meshes, you can see I have two faces here. Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to select the mesh. Okay, so I feel like that should be flipped. Oh, wrong way. So now we have both faces kind of looking at each other. And I'm going to try something. I'm going to select the edge loops from the front of his face to the bottom of his neck. Well, first let me combine these meshes together. So I'm going to select, double click these edge loops for both faces. And I'm going to deselect the back of the head. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to do a move and sew. See if I get these faces to just connect seamlessly. Nope, not going to work. Oh, let me quit this mouth part. Okay, move and sew. I just think it's too complex. Or maybe I need to merge the vertices. I'm just trying something here. That's not good. Merge vertices 0.001. Merge them. And you can see, oh shoot, maybe that was the missing link. What is that? There we go. Now they're moving and sewing together. There we go. Let's do a move and sew now. Ooh, that's not the best. Okay, we got some. Okay, that was the problem. I had a few of the edges from the mouth hole selected. It's just not liking. Let's see what's exactly happening here. That's not the best. I know there's a way we could probably move and sew them together like that. Why don't we look and see how we can just UV it with it being put together like this? All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this face again, just these faces. So I've already got the mouth box and the ear holes and all this stuff made. I'm just going to do a UV. I'm going to do another camera-based projection. And this is what I get. I get a front-facing face. Now I'm going to make a seam running from the back of his head. In fact, I'm going to select the UV there all the way to the UV. Where's the base of that skull? So I'm just kind of selecting UVs to see how far I went down. Okay. So I got these two UVs selected, and then I'm going to do the whole shortest path. Oh, I have to select the tool first. Perfect. From there to like there. And now it's selected the edge exact edge that I wanted. Now I'm going to do a cut. All right. Now let's see what happens whenever I unfold this entire face. There we go. I missed a UV edge. I can go back and cut it and re-unfold it. So I've missed this edge right there. Let's cut it. Now let's unfold it again. Boom. That's so freaky, isn't it? So by actually having the face combined like so, and then cutting an edge from the top of his head down to the bottom of his neck, I was able to get a complete face, uh, pancake face. Gross. All right, so that's a few ways where we can UV a face of a human. And then from there, it's just scaling and puzzling and getting the right layout, which by this point, you guys should be used to. And why don't we look at the other problem spot on the human body? If you can get these two concepts down, you can do the rest of the body pretty easily with the same techniques I'm showing you here. So what we're going to do is we're going to find like a glove. I guess we'll do that edge loop there. Noticing I'm just kind of selecting the faces where I know I want there to be a seam, like the cuff of a long sleeve shirt maybe. And again, I'll just create quick and dirty trash UVs right there. And then what I got to do is figure out a way to split these open. Um, let's just have some fun real quick. Let me just select some UVs. I'm going to select from that UV all the way to that one. And I think that's too far. Yeah, from there to there. Oh, I forgot. I think I've been doing some of this UV stuff on the wrong screen. Oh well. There we go. So that was the face. Okay. So looking at the hand again, I've got my hand kind of just flopped out with a camera projection. And I'm going to use that tool where we can find the shortest edge path. So I'll go into UVs, select this UV, if it's going to let me, down to this UV, click to vert it. I thought I was doing that. Why can't I click them? Oh, I'll just do it on the, ah, it's not going all the way across. I see. I was trying to get it to do something like all the way up and down here, but it was just going around. Let's see, how should we do the hand then? Let's see if I can, I'll pull this over here. I'll just trace some edges. See if I can just split the hand open easily enough. So I'm just kind of trying to see if I can split the hand. At the fingers. There's a lot of ways you can do a hand. That's not the way. Yeah, this is tedious, but it's kind of the only way you can get the right seam you want is just sometimes by selecting each individual seam. So right now I have an edge, continuous edge loop. It's not so much a loop though, because I had a guy zigzag right there. And I'm going to cut right here. And I've cut those. So let's see if I can unfold this now. I don't think it likes it, huh? Let's see. Okay, what I've done is I've kind of created a top and a bottom finger. So you can see there's the thumb, index finger, middle finger, ring finger, pinky. So see how much distortion's on those. I guess it's not too much. Well, that's one way to do the hand. Another way to do it is to much how we cut out the ear on our face up here. We can cut out each finger ring. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'll undo what I just did here. Okay, so we got our hand kind of already projected out like it started out with. What we can do is I'll show us on the index finger real quickly. I can select the edges around the index finger. And I can cut them. I just cut that finger off. So let me go up to here. So I'll select the UV on that finger to shell. We can see that I've just basically cut my finger off. Not literally though. And then all we have to do is we have to still make a seam on this finger so we can flatten it out. So we're going to pick a seam that's the least conspicuous right there. So you can see I have my edge selected there. I'll do a cut, and then I'll do a layout. And there's my finger laid out. And then you would do that for all 5 fingers, and then just lay out the hand. I'll let you guys figure that out on your own. I would probably suggest doing it this way, cutting out each finger. That way you'll get less distortion, but you'll have a few more seams. But at the end of the day, um, less distortion is a good thing. So the give and take between more seams versus less distortion. All right, this video has gone on long enough, guys. So in your assignment, you're going to be doing a human, which will be on its own UV 1:1 scale. You'll be doing a weapon, which will be on its own 1:1 square. And you'll be doing the Atlas spaceship, which will have a few different meshes combined and UV'd and placed together on one UV area. All right, see you next chapter.